Good evening, and welcome to tonight's story. As you settle into the stillness of this moment, let the weight of the day slip away. Perhaps your body feels heavy against the mattress, or your shoulders finally start to soften after carrying the busyness of the hours before. Wherever you are, however you feel, tonight you are invited into a gentle journey. A journey through history, imagination, and invention. Tonight, we will dive into one of the most fascinating, most impactful creations that humanity has ever achieved. A creation that has touched every corner of the planet, shaped the way we live, the way we dream, and the way we connect to one another. The story of how human beings learned to fly. Now, this isn't the kind of story where you'll need to remember every date or every detail. You don't have to hold on to names or memorize technical terms. No, this is a story to fall asleep to. A soft telling of how a dream as old as humanity itself eventually became reality. So just let it wash over you like waves on a shore. Gentle, steady, calming. Take a slow breath in and out. Allow yourself to sink just a little deeper. Let your arms rest more fully, let your legs feel heavy, let your thoughts slow down. As your body unwinds, your mind is free to wander, to imagine, to picture what life must have been like before humans knew what it was to fly. Because for most of human history, the sky was untouchable. It belonged to birds, to clouds, to storms and stars. People could only look up and wonder. They could only dream. And they did, they dreamed often, in every culture, in every time. Think of the ancient Greeks, who told the story of Icarus and Daedalus. Wax wings, feather by feather, a desperate leap into the air. The dream of freedom, the tragedy of ambition. Or picture ancient China, where people learned to craft kites that soared on the wind. Not just playthings, but tools for measuring distances, for sending signals, for catching the attention of heaven itself. Imagine the colors, the shapes, the fluttering sound of silk as it lifted into the sky. All across the world, people filled their imaginations with the thought of flying. In India, there were legends of Vimanas, flying chariots of the gods. In medieval Europe, monks and inventors strapped wings to their arms and leapt from towers, believing that maybe this time, maybe with enough faith and courage, they might glide like birds. Most failed, of course. Many were hurt. But each attempt kept the dream alive. And so, as you listen, you can let these images pass softly through your mind. A monk stretching his arms wide, wooden wings rattling in the wind. A scholar in Cordoba building a silk and wood glider, stepping into the unknown. Leonardo da Vinci sketching, candlelight flickering over the pages of his notebook, as he drew strange contraptions, helicopters made of screws, wings shaped like bats, gliders with delicate frames. None of these worked as true airplanes, but that wasn't the point. Each one was part of the longing. Each one was a small step, carrying forward the same question: what if humans could really do this? What if we could truly fly? Let your breathing find its rhythm now. In and out. Just as steady as the rhythm of these attempts. Each one beginning with hope, each one ending with failure, each one leading the way to something greater. The dream of flight was not just about curiosity. It was about more. It was about freedom. The freedom to escape walls and boundaries. The freedom to go farther than the legs could carry, farther than ships could sail. The freedom to see the world from above, to look down and understand it in a new way. For centuries, the dream remained out of reach. But it never disappeared. And that's important to remember. Because sometimes the most remarkable things humanity achieves begin not with success, but with persistence. With people who refuse to let go of a dream. Imagine for a moment that you are one of those early dreamers. Standing on a hill, or on the roof of a monastery. You feel the wind brush across your face. You spread your arms, wooden wings strapped to your body. Your heart is racing. You don't know if it will work. You only know that you have to try. You leap, and for the briefest moment, the air catches you. there's a thrill, a spark of possibility. And then, gravity pulls you down. The fall is inevitable. But in your mind, something has shifted. You've felt it. You've tasted it. And now the idea is alive. That is how progress begins. Not with instant success, but with moments of inspiration that carry forward, generation after generation. Centuries later, balloons would rise over Paris, carrying humans into the air for the first time. Centuries after that, engines would roar, and machines of canvas and wood would lift from the ground under their own power. But we're not there yet. For now, in this beginning, the dream of flight still belongs to poets, to inventors, to the reckless and the brave. As you listen, you might find your mind wandering. That's perfectly fine. The story is here to guide you gently, to give your imagination something soft and steady to hold onto while your body sinks deeper into rest. Think again of the sky. Vast, endless, full of mystery. To our ancestors, it was home to the gods, to angels, to mysteries beyond reach. To fly was to transcend the human condition itself. No wonder it was so tempting. No wonder people risked everything for even a taste of it. And yet, as impossible as it seemed, the dream never went away. Through myths, through experiments, through sketches and stumbles, humanity kept moving forward. And slowly, inch by inch, the impossible began to look a little more possible. Tonight, in this first part of the story, we linger here, at the dawn of it all. We don't need to rush ahead to engines or airfields. We don't need to skip to roaring jets or crowded airports. For now, we are still standing on those ancient hilltops, still gazing upward, still asking the question, what if? Close your eyes a little heavier now. Breathe in the stillness. Let the images of those dreamers fade into the background of your thoughts. Because this is how it all began, not with machines, but with longing. Not with success, but with endless attempts. Not with power, but with imagination. As the story continues in nights to come, we'll follow the dream further. We'll see balloons floating like lanterns over cities, inspiring awe and fear. We'll meet mechanics and engineers who studied the air itself, who built wind tunnels, who crafted the first powered flights. We'll see how nations began to demand flight, how war and ambition accelerated the dream. And we'll see how, once it was achieved, flight reshaped the way we see our planet and ourselves. But all of that comes later. For tonight, this is enough. To know that for as long as we have looked to the sky, we have wanted to rise into it. To know that airplanes were not just machines, but answers to ancient questions. To feel the comfort of knowing that persistence, no matter how slow, no matter how clumsy, can carry us into the impossible. So as your eyes grow heavier, let yourself drift on this thought: humans have always been restless. Always searching, always reaching. And sometimes, that restlessness is what carries us into the sky. Breathe in. Breathe out. And sleep, while the story continues. When we left off, the dream of flight was still just that, a dream. Humanity had admired the skies, drawn inspiration from birds, and toyed with wings of wood and cloth. But by the 19th century, a very different kind of momentum was stirring. Science was catching up to imagination, and a world that once considered flying men a fantasy was starting to whisper, maybe. The Industrial Revolution had transformed society. Steam engines carried trains across continents, telegraphs pulsed messages across oceans, and factories churned out goods at a pace no one had seen before. It was an age of invention, of daring, and of people who believed they could bend nature to their will. It was also an age of restless curiosity. If steam could power ships across the seas, why not find a way to power men across the skies? One of the early steps toward solving this puzzle was the study of aerodynamics. Engineers and tinkerers began to realize that flying wasn't just about strapping wings to your arms and flapping hard enough. Birds weren't simply strong, they were clever engineers of nature. Their wing shapes, feathers, and gliding patterns held secrets. To unlock the sky, humanity would need to understand the science of lift, drag, and thrust. Enter Sir George Cayley, often called the father of aeronautics. In the early 1800s, Cayley carefully observed birds and sketched out principles of flight. He proposed that a successful flying machine would need four distinct elements: lift, drag, thrust, and weight. It sounds obvious to us now, but at the time it was revolutionary. In fact, in 1853, Cayley built a glider large enough to carry a person, and, depending on which account you trust, either his coachman or an unlucky volunteer was the first passenger. Legend has it the man was not amused and quit his job afterward. Still, Cayley had proven something profound: human flight wasn't just myth. It could be engineered. Cayley's gliders set the stage for others. In Germany, Otto Lilienthal became obsessed with building and flying gliders. By the 1890s, he had constructed dozens, making more than 2,000 flights. Lilienthal was the first person to truly show the world what sustained, controlled gliding looked like. Newspapers printed images of him soaring like a great bird above the hills, his mustache and determined face becoming icons of human daring. He wasn't just playing with contraptions, he was gathering real data about wing shapes and control. Tragically, Lilienthal's obsession ended in disaster when he crashed during a flight in 1896, breaking his spine. His last words, spoken to his brother, were haunting: "Sacrifices must be made." But sacrifices like Lilienthal's planted seeds. Across the Atlantic, two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, were paying attention. Wilbur and Orville Wright weren't aristocrats, scientists, or soldiers. They were bicycle mechanics. Their modest workshop sold and repaired bicycles, those new two-wheeled machines that were themselves symbols of balance and freedom. But bicycles also taught them lessons: how weight shifts affect stability, how to fine-tune moving parts, how to trust in mechanics over brute force. The Wright brothers were fascinated by Lilienthal's experiments, as well as by the reports of others who dared to chase the sky. They devoured books on aeronautics, corresponded with leading thinkers, and began their own experiments with kites and gliders. What set them apart wasn't just curiosity, it was relentless patience. The Wrights treated flight not as a dream but as a puzzle to be solved. By 1900, they were testing gliders on the windy sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The location wasn't chosen at random. The area's strong, steady winds and soft sand dunes made it ideal for experiments. For 3 years, they refined their designs, learning how to balance lift and drag, and most importantly, how to control a machine in flight. Many before them had built contraptions that briefly lifted off, but none had figured out how to actually steer them. The Wrights introduced a system of wing warping, twisting the wings slightly to control roll and stability. This was their masterstroke. On December 17, 1903, after countless trials, failures, and adjustments, the Wright brothers made history. Orville took the first flight, lasting 12 seconds and covering 120 feet. It wasn't grand or dramatic. In fact, if you blinked, you might have missed it. But in that moment, everything changed. Humanity was no longer earthbound. A man had flown under his own control, powered by an engine, with wings that truly worked. Of course, not everyone was impressed right away. In fact, when the Wrights tried to share their achievement, many newspapers ignored or dismissed them. People had been hearing wild claims of flying machines for years, and most assumed this was just another tall tale. But the Wrights were not just dreamers, they were meticulous record keepers. Photographs, logs, and witnesses eventually proved undeniable. Within a few short years, their fragile machine evolved into something sturdier, faster, and more reliable. And here's where the story of airplanes takes a very human turn. You might imagine that the world welcomed this miracle of flight with open arms, ready to explore the skies in peace. But as so often happens, governments and militaries were the first to see its potential. If a machine could fly, then it could scout enemy positions, deliver messages, and perhaps even drop explosives. Airplanes were not merely symbols of wonder, they were tools of power. By the time of World War I, barely a decade after Kitty Hawk, airplanes were already being mass-produced for combat. At first they were used for reconnaissance, but soon machine guns were mounted on them, turning duels in the sky into deadly dogfights. The Wright brothers' delicate dream of soaring above the Earth had become entangled with humanity's oldest habit, conflict. Still, the war also accelerated innovation. Engines became more powerful, designs more aerodynamic. Pilots became celebrities, their bravery mythologized as knights of the air. By the war's end, flight had advanced in ways no one could have imagined in 1903. Humanity had leapt from 12 seconds in the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk to fleets of aircraft changing the course of battles. But flight was never only about war. Even as governments invested in military aviation, dreamers imagined other possibilities. What if planes could connect cities, nations, and continents? What if the sky became a highway, shrinking the world in ways ships and trains never could? The 1920s and 30s saw the rise of commercial aviation. Airliners carried mail and passengers, first across short distances, then over oceans. Companies like Pan Am promised a glamorous new era of travel, with planes like flying hotels. The dream of shrinking the world was becoming real. And of course, this period gave us larger-than-life figures. Charles Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927 captivated the world, proving that airplanes weren't just machines for war or stunts, they could link continents. Amelia Earhart, with her daring flights and bold spirit, inspired millions, showing that the sky was open to anyone willing to chase it. The airplane had quickly become more than just a machine. It was a symbol. A symbol of freedom, of modernity, of possibility. For the first time in history, humans could rise above the clouds, look down on oceans and mountains, and realize that the barriers which once defined their world were shrinking. By the 1930s, the foundations of modern aviation were firmly in place. Planes were faster, safer, and more efficient. They weren't just curiosities anymore, they were part of the fabric of modern life. And yet, the true story of why humanity really invented airplanes was only beginning to unfold. Because while the Wrights, Cayley, and Lilienthal may have been motivated by curiosity, by science, and by the thrill of solving a puzzle, the world itself began to shape a very different narrative. Airplanes were not just invented for the joy of flying. They were invented to serve the needs, ambitions, and sometimes the darker desires of humanity itself. Whether for war, commerce, or exploration, the airplane became a reflection of what people wanted most: speed, power, connection, and control. And that realization sets the stage for the next part of our story, where we see how airplanes evolved from fragile wooden frames into roaring metal giants, reshaping the 20th century in ways no one, not even the Wright brothers themselves, could have predicted. By the late 1930s, the airplane had already made a name for itself. It had proven it could cross oceans, carry mail, link cities, and, unfortunately, rain destruction from the skies in the hands of militaries. Yet even then, few could have predicted just how quickly aviation would advance in the decades to come. The difference between the fragile canvas wings of 1903 and the roaring machines of the 1940s was like comparing a child's toy boat to a steel battleship. The pace of progress was dizzying, and much of it, for better or worse, was driven by the urgency of war. When World War II broke out in 1939, airplanes were no longer side players as they had been in the First World War. They were central. Nations raced to design faster, deadlier, more efficient aircraft, because dominance in the air meant dominance on the ground. This was the era when legendary machines emerged: the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, the Mustang, and the Zero. These weren't just planes, they were engineering marvels that came to symbolize entire nations. In Europe, the Battle of Britain marked one of the earliest large-scale aerial campaigns. German bombers poured across the English Channel, hoping to soften Britain for invasion. What stood in their way were the Royal Air Force's Spitfires and Hurricanes, sleek, agile fighters piloted by young men who sometimes had only weeks of training before being thrown into combat. Winston Churchill famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was speaking about these pilots, who turned the tide of battle and proved that air power alone could alter the fate of a nation. Across the globe, the Pacific Theater revealed another face of aviation's dark potential. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 showed that airplanes could strike with devastating surprise across vast distances, changing the very nature of warfare. No longer did armies meet only on fields or trenches, wars could begin from the sky in an instant. Carrier-based planes, launched from floating airstrips in the sea, extended the reach of militaries to places once thought untouchable. But perhaps the most haunting symbol of this era came in 1945, when two American bombers, Enola Gay and Bockscar, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a matter of minutes, airplanes demonstrated a capacity for destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not only a turning point in war but in human history. The airplane, once dreamed of as a symbol of freedom, had become the vehicle for humanity's darkest invention. And yet, even in the ashes of war, there were glimpses of another destiny for flight. The same technological leaps that produced bombers and fighters also created aircraft capable of carrying more passengers, more safely, over greater distances. Engines grew stronger, airframes sturdier, navigation more precise. The wartime rush for innovation unintentionally laid the foundation for the golden age of commercial aviation. By the late 1940s and early 50s, a new word was entering the vocabulary: jet. Unlike propeller-driven planes, jets compressed and ignited air in a turbine, producing far greater thrust. They were faster, smoother, and capable of cruising at altitudes where the air was thin and the skies were calm. For militaries, jets meant superiority in speed and maneuverability. For civilians, it meant something else entirely: the possibility of shrinking the globe even further. Imagine the contrast for someone living through that period. In 1903, if you wanted to cross the Atlantic, you boarded a steamship for a week-long voyage across unpredictable seas. By the 1950s, you could board a jetliner and be in New York one day, Paris the next. The world was suddenly smaller, closer, more connected. Families separated by oceans could reunite in hours. Businessmen could cross continents in a single trip. The idea of a global citizen was no longer poetic, it was practical. This transformation was so rapid, it almost defied comprehension. The Wright brothers' first flight had been shorter than the wingspan of a Boeing 747. Yet within a lifetime, humanity had gone from fragile wooden frames to pressurized cabins carrying hundreds of passengers at 35,000 feet. For people living in that era, airplanes must have felt like magic machines, collapsing time and space. But airplanes weren't just machines of convenience. They were also powerful symbols of status and modernity. Airports became cathedrals of progress, gleaming terminals where people dressed in their finest clothes to board flights. Flying wasn't routine, it was glamorous. Stewardesses served meals with silverware, pilots were admired like celebrities, and passengers felt they were stepping into the future every time they fastened a seatbelt. Of course, not everyone shared equally in this marvel. Tickets were expensive, and early air travel was largely the domain of the wealthy. For the working class, flying remained a distant dream, something read about in newspapers or seen in newsreels. But just as with trains and cars before it, what began as a luxury eventually trickled down. Over the decades, competition, mass production, and global demand made flying accessible to more and more people. Still, it wasn't all smooth cruising. The airplane's rise also came with turbulence. Noise pollution, accidents, and the ever-present fear of hijackings reminded people that the sky, like the sea before it, could never be entirely tamed. And geopolitically, airplanes gave nations new ways to project power. The Cold War became a theater not just of ideology but of altitude, spy planes like the U-2 soaring above enemy lines, strategic bombers circling like vultures, ready to unleash nuclear fire if orders ever came. Yet even here, in this dangerous balance of fear, airplanes carried a strange duality. They were instruments of destruction, yes, but also of deterrence. The fact that planes could deliver devastation anywhere at any time may have, paradoxically, prevented it. Humanity was walking a tightrope, with the airplane as both its safety net and its most frightening danger. But let's step away from geopolitics for a moment and consider what airplanes meant for everyday life. They changed the way people thought about distance, culture, and identity. A family in London could taste New York bagels within a day. A businesswoman in Tokyo could strike deals in Los Angeles and be home within the week. Artists, musicians, and writers could share their work across continents, feeding into a global culture that no longer had to wait months for exchange. Airplanes made the world not just smaller, but faster. They turned a patchwork of nations into a web of connections. Even the way we look at Earth was transformed. Pilots and passengers gazing down from their windows saw the planet in a way no one before them had. Mountains, rivers, and cities revealed themselves as patterns, connected and continuous. For many, this aerial perspective inspired a new sense of unity, that the world was one fragile sphere, stitched together by roots in the sky. Later, astronauts would amplify this feeling from space, but airplanes gave ordinary people their first taste of the planet as a single, shared home. By the time the jet age was in full swing in the 1960s, it was clear that humanity had crossed a threshold. The airplane was no longer an experiment or a novelty. It was a fact of modern life. It had become as essential to the 20th century as the printing press had been to the Renaissance or the steam engine to the Industrial Revolution. And so, when we pause and reflect on what airplanes really did to our world, it's striking. They were never just machines for getting from point A to point B. They were amplifiers of human intention. They reflected what humanity wanted most in each era: the edge in war, the thrill of adventure, the power of connection, the reach of influence. Whether in the roar of a Spitfire diving into battle or the quiet hum of a 747 soaring over oceans, airplanes carried more than people. They carried the story of human ambition itself. But as transformative as this before and after moment was, the story of airplanes didn't stop in the 20th century. They kept evolving, kept spreading, kept shaping the way humanity lived, fought, and dreamed. The next chapter would see them not only as national symbols but as global industries, shaping economies and everyday lives in ways the Wright brothers could never have imagined when their wooden flyer first wobbled into the wind. After the Second World War, the airplane was no longer just a marvel or a weapon. It was a necessity. Every nation that could afford it scrambled to build fleets, both military and civilian, recognizing that the sky was now a domain as crucial as land or sea. The question was no longer whether airplanes would change the world; they already had. The question was how deeply and how permanently they would weave themselves into the fabric of daily life, business, and politics. The spread began almost immediately. Nations battered by war saw aviation as both a practical tool for rebuilding and a symbol of rebirth. Europe, with its shattered railways and broken roads, found in air travel a way to stitch itself back together. Germany, once divided into rubble, reconnected its cities with small prop planes and, eventually, modern jets. Britain turned its wartime airfields into civilian airports. France, Italy, and the Netherlands built carriers like Air France, Alitalia, and KLM into national champions, flying flags in the sky as much as they carried passengers. In the United States, the boom was staggering. America had emerged from the war with both an intact industrial base and the technological upper hand. Factories that once churned out B-17 bombers and P-51 Mustangs were repurposed to build airliners. Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas shifted gears, launching models like the DC-4 and, later, the iconic Boeing 707. Suddenly, flying was not just a military project, it was an American export, a way to project not bombs but business and culture across the globe. And spread it did. By the 1950s and 60s, nearly every continent had its national airline. Planes were no longer symbols just of war or wealth, they were symbols of identity. To fly on Japan Airlines or Pan Am wasn't just to buy a ticket, it was to participate in a story of nationhood, of pride, of belonging to the modern world. Airplanes were carrying more than passengers, they were carrying the flags of nations. But the spread of aviation wasn't just about who flew the planes. It was about where the planes could go. And that, in turn, demanded an entirely new infrastructure. Airfields became airports, airports became hubs, and hubs became megacities in their own right. Think about places like London Heathrow, New York JFK, or Dubai International. These weren't just transit points, they became the new crossroads of humanity. Shops, hotels, offices, even art galleries sprung up around terminals. An airport was a gateway, yes, but also a marketplace, a meeting ground, a place where cultures literally collided in the form of passengers rushing past one another with bags and passports. One of the most fascinating accelerators of aviation spread was, strangely enough, global tension. The Cold War wasn't just an arms race on the ground, it was a contest in the skies. The Soviets poured resources into Aeroflot, which, at its height, became the largest airline in the world. The Americans pushed Boeing and McDonnell Douglas to keep innovating, producing aircraft that could fly farther, faster, and with greater efficiency. Even neutral countries, caught between the blocks, invested heavily in aviation to ensure they weren't left behind in the great aerial race. Then came the turning points. The 1958 launch of the Boeing 707 ushered in the jet age, and with it, a cultural revolution. For the first time, middle-class families could realistically dream of flying abroad. The 707 could carry 150 passengers at nearly 600 miles per hour, cutting travel times in half compared to propeller-driven planes. It wasn't just faster, it was smoother, quieter, more reliable. This was the plane that finally made air travel a mainstream experience, not just a glamorous novelty. The 1970s brought an even bigger leap, the wide-body jet. With the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies, the world entered a new era of mass travel. For the first time, a single aircraft could carry more than 400 people. Airports had to build new runways and terminals just to handle it. And with the drop in per seat costs, suddenly vacations to Europe or Asia weren't limited to the elite. Middle-class families could book a seat on a jumbo jet and see the world. Tourism exploded, economies globalized, and cultures mingled like never before. And yet, even as airplanes brought the world together, they also deepened divides. Access to air travel still reflected inequality. While wealthy nations developed thriving airlines and busy hubs, many poorer countries lagged behind, connected only by infrequent, outdated planes. For them, the sky was still a privilege, not a given. Even today, less than 20% of the world's population has ever been on an airplane. For billions, flight remains something to watch from the ground, neck craned upward as a jet leaves a contrail across the sky. But for those who could access it, airplanes truly reshaped life. Think of business. Where once a deal might take months of correspondence by letter, executives could now fly to Tokyo on Monday, negotiate Tuesday, and be home by the weekend. Entire industries adapted to this speed. Financial markets became global, supply chains stretched across continents, and just-in-time delivery became possible, all because airplanes made time zones feel negotiable. Wars, too, changed. Not only in the sense of bombers or fighters, but in logistics. The Berlin airlift of 1948–49 showed the world that entire cities could be sustained by air alone. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew food, fuel, and supplies into blockaded West Berlin, proving that control of the skies could mean survival. Later, during conflicts from Vietnam to the Gulf War, air transport allowed troops, tanks, and equipment to move at a scale no other technology could match. And then there was the cultural impact. Airplanes made migration easier, allowing diasporas to remain connected. They allowed artists, musicians, and athletes to move globally, blending styles and influences in ways that reshaped culture itself. Think of the Beatles flying to America in 1964, ushering in the British invasion. Or athletes competing in international tournaments that would have been impossible without reliable flight. The airplane wasn't just a machine, it was a cultural bridge. Of course, no discussion of aviation spread would be complete without acknowledging the darker moments. Airplane accidents, though statistically rare, became international tragedies. Hijackings and terrorism in the 1970s and beyond showed that the very openness of flight could be exploited. And the environmental cost, the carbon emissions, the noise pollution, began to weigh heavily as the decades rolled on. The sky, once limitless, was proving to have consequences. Yet, humanity kept flying. Even crises like the oil shocks of the 1970s, or the tragedies of September 11, 2001, could not ground the world for long. Each time, the industry adapted, with more efficient engines, stricter security, new regulations. The pattern was clear: aviation wasn't just spreading, it was embedding itself, becoming too central to untangle from modern life. By the late 20th century, entire regions defined themselves by their airports. Cities like Dubai, Singapore, and Hong Kong became global hubs not because of natural geography, but because of their strategic placement in air routes. These cities rose as crossroads of the world, where millions of passengers and tons of cargo converged. Without airplanes, they would have been local trading posts at best. With airplanes, they became global giants. And so, the spread of aviation can be seen as more than just technology expanding outward. It was humanity building a new kind of map. One no longer drawn by rivers or mountains, but by air corridors. Invisible highways crisscrossing the skies, carrying people, goods, and ideas at speeds once thought impossible. It was, in many ways, the final knitting together of the world into a single, interconnected system. By the time the 21st century dawned, it was impossible to imagine life without airplanes. They were as natural as roads, as expected as electricity. And while their story was still unfolding, one truth was already clear: once humanity had tasted the sky, it would never go back. Air travel today is so ordinary that most of us barely think about the sheer miracle of it. To book a ticket, step into a tube of aluminum, sit for a few hours while sipping ginger ale and watching a movie, and then step out in another country, halfway across the world, would have been considered the stuff of fantasy for almost all of human history. And yet, this quiet marvel of modern life, the airplane, is not just about speed or convenience. It has woven itself into the very fabric of our economies, our societies, and even our identities. To understand its modern legacy is to recognize that airplanes are not just machines in the sky, they are the vessels through which globalization, commerce, and even our shared sense of humanity have been carried. Let's start with something familiar. Imagine an ordinary airport on an ordinary weekday. Thousands of people from dozens of countries shuffle through security lines, drag wheeled suitcases across polished floors, and wait by gates where digital boards flash exotic destinations: Tokyo, Paris, Sao Paulo, Nairobi. Each person has their own story. Maybe they're chasing opportunity, maybe they're returning home, maybe they're escaping something behind them. And every one of them, knowingly or not, is participating in one of the greatest infrastructures ever built by humankind, the aviation network. With hundreds of thousands of flights each day, the world's airways are now like invisible highways in the sky, stitching together cities, economies, and cultures. Without them, our globalized world simply wouldn't exist. The modern legacy of airplanes is most obvious in the economy. Air cargo today moves not just luxuries but lifelines. A fresh salmon caught off the coast of Norway can be on a dinner plate in New York the very next day. A microchip manufactured in Taiwan can be installed in a smartphone in Berlin within hours of shipping. Time-sensitive goods, from vaccines and medicines to exotic fruits, depend on the speed and reach of air travel. In fact, the value of goods transported by air far exceeds their weight. Though air cargo accounts for less than 1% of world trade by volume, it represents over 35% by value. That imbalance says everything about how planes have reshaped commerce. They don't just move objects, they move urgency, importance, and value across borders. And yet, the influence of airplanes stretches well beyond economics. They have transformed how we understand distance and culture. Once upon a time, far away really meant far. To visit another continent could require weeks or even months of dangerous sea travel. Today, the phrase far away has lost some of its weight. You could wake up in London, have lunch in New York, and be home again by nightfall, jet-lagged, perhaps, but home. This compression of space and time has allowed ideas, cultures, and relationships to flourish in ways that were once unthinkable. Families scattered across continents remain connected. Students study abroad. Artists, musicians, and thinkers cross oceans to collaborate. Tourism, too, has become one of the world's largest industries, powered almost entirely by aviation. The concept of a world traveler is no longer reserved for the wealthy elite, it is a role millions of people inhabit each year. But the legacy of airplanes is also deeply cultural in another sense. They have become symbols. To some, they represent freedom, the ability to escape borders, politics, or even the limits of one's own hometown. To others, they are symbols of ambition, of humankind's audacity to rise above nature. Think of the way airports themselves are often portrayed in film and literature as places of departure, of reunions, of longing and excitement. A single airplane lifting into the sky has the power to trigger emotions of hope, separation, or adventure. It's remarkable that a machine designed to be practical has also become a metaphor for human dreams. Of course, not all legacies are gentle or inspiring. Modern aviation has its shadows. The ease of air travel has also contributed to the rapid spread of diseases, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, when flights accelerated the transmission of the virus across continents. Airplanes are also significant contributors to climate change, accounting for about 2 to 3% of global co-emissions, a number expected to rise as more people fly. The skies are now crowded, too. Thousands of planes crisscross the globe at any given moment, and the pressure on airports, air traffic control, and fuel supply chains is immense. The modern world runs on airplanes, but it also wrestles with the consequences of that dependence. Still, humanity has always been a species of trade-offs, balancing progress with its costs. And when we look at airplanes as a whole, their role in shaping our collective future is undeniable. Consider the geopolitical weight they carry. Military aviation continues to dominate global strategy. Fighter jets, drones, and massive transport planes are as crucial to defense as swords and horses once were. The ability to project power across oceans in a matter of hours has redefined what it means to be a superpower. In humanitarian terms, too, airplanes save lives. They deliver emergency aid, evacuate civilians, and connect disaster-stricken regions with relief that would otherwise arrive far too late. Then there's the quieter legacy, the one you feel only when you're sitting by a window seat at 35,000 feet. You look down, and the world seems both vast and fragile. Cities glow like constellations, mountains stretch like frozen waves, rivers twist like silver threads. In that suspended moment, you realize that flight hasn't just changed how we live, it has changed how we see ourselves. It has given us a perspective once reserved only for birds and gods. To look down on Earth from the sky is to understand it differently, as one interconnected home. Airplanes have also subtly influenced how we measure time and space. Jet lag, for instance, is now part of the human experience, something our ancestors could never have imagined. The very rhythm of business, of international diplomacy, of global sports events, all of it now assumes that human beings can gather across continents in mere hours. The Olympics, the United Nations, international film festivals, global summits, these institutions are possible only because the airplane exists. As we move further into the future, the legacy of airplanes continues to evolve. New technologies like electric planes, biofuels, and supersonic travel promise to reshape flight yet again. Space tourism, too, has begun borrowing from aviation's legacy, treating the sky not as a ceiling but as a gateway. The Wright brothers could hardly have imagined it. Their fragile wooden craft has evolved into machines that not only circle the Earth but aspire to leave it entirely. And yet, for all the grandeur of modern flight, the heart of its legacy is surprisingly humble. It lies in the stories of ordinary people, millions of them, who step onto planes each day. A grandmother flying across the world to hold her grandchild for the first time. A refugee escaping danger and finding safety. A scientist attending a conference that sparks a collaboration leading to a breakthrough. These are the quiet, invisible threads of connection that airplanes weave every day. So as we drift toward the close of this chapter, let us remember that the modern legacy of airplanes isn't only about technology, power, or even convenience. It's about how they've shrunk our planet, how they've softened borders, how they've made us neighbors across oceans. It's about how they've allowed us to imagine ourselves not just as citizens of nations, but as citizens of the world. And with that thought, take a deep breath, relax into the gentle rhythm of this story, and let the sound of the skies carry you further into rest. Because the story of airplanes is not just about machines or invention, it's about us, about humanity, and the strange, wonderful ways we've learned to take flight together.